All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Settle in, because today we're taking on a pretty wild perspective. We're going to play the role of an ancient therapist, let's call it a dragon therapist, looking back across the ages to theatrically analyze a truly tragic psychological case study. We are looking at the architecture of moral hypocrisy through this figure known as the Pale Inquisitor. And by digging into the source material, we'll synthesize both the heroic and the cynical views to see exactly what happens when the human psyche just absolutely refuses to face its own darkness and instead, well, projects it out onto the entire world.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just look at this quote. It perfectly captures that dark, gaping abyss of the human psyche we're exploring today. The ultimate tragedy isn't making a mistake. It's actually spending your entire life constructing this elaborate facade just to hide from your own internal emptiness. The source material presents this not just as a character study, but as a hardcore clinical diagnosis of a very specific kind of spiritual failure, one where rigid, unbending judgment literally prevents any true personal growth.
So, moving right along to Chapter 1, The Hillside of Judgment, the vantage point of hollow observation.
Let's set the scene here, almost like a graphic novel, right? Picture this desolate, twilight hillside. Perched way up high above the valley is the Pale Inquisitor, and he's looking down with eyes dim-lit by a gaze of just absolute judgment. Now, down in the mud of that valley is a figure known as the Lone Wanderer. And this contrast between the two, it's the whole foundational dynamic of our case study. To the Inquisitor, the Wanderer looks like just a cynical wanderer, somebody totally lost in the mud of the abyss. Meanwhile, the Inquisitor clings to this delusion that he's walking some sacred, higher path. But the text makes it brilliantly, painfully clear the Inquisitor's position is really just a vantage point of hollow observation. It is entirely disconnected from the actual, gritty labor required to become what the source calls a unified subject. The Wanderer is down there doing the hard work in the mud, while the Inquisitor is, just judging from the bleachers.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Tasting the Scarlet Fruit, the Descent into the Psychic Vacuum.
So how exactly did the Inquisitor end up on this lonely little hill of judgment? Well, as any good clinical analysis will tell you, profound self-righteousness is rarely a primary trait, right? It's almost always a late-stage symptom of some deep internal discord. He wasn't born a high judge. He actually began as the pale criminal, or rather, he's described specifically as a bridge that broke, under the crushing weight of his own internal chaos. Step 2 in his descent was tasting the scarlet fruit, and this brilliantly illustrates his core problem. This scarlet fruit is such a powerful metaphor. It represents his past actions, deeds he committed but just couldn't own up to or integrate into his sense of self. And because he couldn't process his own actions, he hits Step 3. He starts drifting through this psychic vacuum, defined by internal shame and spiritual fragmentation. Basically, he was just breaking apart from the inside out.
All right, Chapter 3, Wearing the Violet Mask, the Scaffolding of Stolen Meaning.
Now, in this state of total fragmentation, a highly theatrical transformation happens. The source describes how the shadow of humanity itself descended from this place called null space and physically fused with his internal void. To survive the sheer terror of his own emptiness, he didn't seek healing. No, he sought a disguise. We define it here as the violet mask. So the crucial point is, this is absolutely not true heroic virtue. It's a fragile, stolen shell made up of discarded noble virtues. The Inquisitor uses this mask as this deceptive scaffolding to give his hollow existence some sense of stolen meaning. By adopting this persona of a high judge, he successfully escapes the crippling anxiety of his own emptiness. He doesn't fix the void, he just builds a really pretty wall over it.
Moving to Chapter 4, The Weaponized Mirror, Justice as Tribalistic Aggression.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the tool itself is corrupted. Picture the Inquisitor gripping an object known as the Mirror of Justice, with white-knuckled intensity, just whispering out into the wind that he, and he alone, is the true guardian of the heroic ideal. But look at how he and the Lone Wanderer actually utilize this exact same tool. When you're entirely disconnected from your own inner truth, even the tools of justice become dangerously warped. The Wanderer uses the mirror internally as a tool for truthful self-perception, aiming it right at himself to shatter his own illusions, what the text calls his golden mask. But the Inquisitor, he turns the mirror outward. He uses it as a literal weapon of tribalistic aggression. He uses his self-proclaimed virtue as a shroud to project the unresolved shadow rotting within his own heart onto the rest of the world. He externalizes his resentment and his desire for legal revenge just to strike at the darkness in others. He acts as a breaker of tablets while remaining completely 100% blind to his own corruption.
Let's check out Chapter 5,
refusing the alchemical dance, fleeing the great reason of the body. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this entire trajectory represents a massive, tragic failure within what the source calls the age of the hero. The Inquisitor is ultimately a bridge that broke under the crushing, impossible weight of his violet mask. Let's look at his clinical failures here. Unlike the Wanderer, who courageously performed the alchemical dance to turn his internal poison into fuel, the Inquisitor goes the exact opposite route. First, he sacrifices his unique human personality to the collective shadow. Second, he clings to the safety of communal morals and false idols because that gaping abyss inside him is just way too terrifying. Third, he actively flees what the text beautifully calls the great reason of the body and the unknown sage of the blood. And finally, he absolutely refuses to say a holy yeah to the consequences of his own nature. Because he refuses to transform his poison into fuel, his judgment is completely sterile. He becomes literally nothing more than a judge of ghosts.
And now, Chapter 6, Architect of the Void, Master of the Heroic Ideals Language. So the theatrical scene kind of closes with the sun setting behind the Inquisitor's hillside. And as the dragon therapist observing all this, we really have to note the immense tragedy of his reality. He remains a solitary witness to a profound transformation going on in the valley below, a transformation he can never ever achieve himself. And that brings us to our final diagnosis for the Pale Inquisitor. He is the architect of the void. He has perfectly mastered the language and the aesthetics of the heroic ideal, but he has never actually stepped into the fire of the dark night of the soul to face his own internal dragon. He's a total stranger to internal sacredness. The source material leaves us with this really profound warning. Without the courageous authorship of your own story, without integrating your own dark shadow, walking the so-called higher path is a complete delusion. It is merely a descent into a much deeper, highly refined form of spiritual starvation. As we wrap up this clinical study of hollow virtue, I want to leave you with a haunting question, one that the Pale Inquisitor totally failed to answer. Do you have the courage to step into the fire of the dark night of the soul and actually face your dragon? Or, kind of like the Inquisitor perched up on his lonely hill, are you merely projecting your shadows outward, slowly starving in the void? It's a heavy question, I know, but it's really the only one that truly matters on the path to becoming a unified subject. Keep reflecting on that, and hey, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.